Dr. Kendrick, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for doing this. Welcome to our little community here. There'll be more people, I'm sure, joining here as this gets going for you guys on YouTube. You can catch the whole thing at Revero. I wanted to say, first of all, I've kind of read some of your stuff over the years. I've been really fascinated with what you've been doing. And I just got done reading your book the other day. I was on a plane flying and I was able to read it. So it was quite fascinating, the newest book, The Clot Thickens. So hopefully we can discuss some of that. Would you be kind enough to just tell a little bit about your background for the people that are unfamiliar with you?
Well, yeah, I'm a doctor well, I now live near Manchester in England. I graduated in Aberdeen University in Scotland. I work as a primary care doctor. Or I'm not quite sure what you call family doctor in the UK. I have a keen interest in heart disease. I've been studying it for years and years, mostly going in the wrong direction. But I like to think in the last 10 years or so, I managed to turn myself around and go in the right direction. So I also like to I like to play squash and ski and play golf. And when the weather's like it is today, I like to sit in front of a fire and do very little else. So that's kind of me.
Yeah, I'm sure it's fairly chilly where you're at. Let me ask you, so you said about 10 years ago, what got you interested in heart disease? I mean, you're already a physician, but what made you really want to delve into maybe looking at what's causing heart disease? And it doesn't necessarily align with what many people think it does, or at least in part it doesn't.
Yeah. Well, in fact, when I was at medical school, going back many years, Scotland had the highest rate of heart disease, coronary heart disease, cardiovascular disease, whatever. Unfortunately, the terms are all over the place here. But anyway, I'll just call it heart disease in the world. Whether that's true or not, I think it was pretty much true. One thing I have discovered is that figures are difficult to get hold of sometimes. And I wondered why. And obviously, you're training as a doctor. The thing that kills most people is heart disease. And we were told the same thing as everyone was told. It's because you eat too much saturated fat. It raises your blood cholesterol level, and then that thickens up your arteries and you die. And the Scottish diet was held up as a particularly bad example, because we had such things as deep fried Mars bar, which is where you get a Mars bar, you wrap it in batter and stick it in a deep fryer and then eat it, which I have actually tried to do once, and it's pretty disgusting. But and then I very keen on France. I went to France a number of times. I've been skiing there and on holiday in the summer. And one thing I knew about France was they had one of the lowest rates of heart disease in the world. And I started looking at it and thought, well, it's interesting because the French eat more saturated fat than we do in Scotland. Not much more, but a bit more. And yet their rate of heart disease was about a fifth. And I looked at their cholesterol levels, and their cholesterol levels were slightly lower than they were in Scotland. And then I looked at all the other risk factors that I could get hold of to do with the French, which were things like rate of diabetes, average blood pressure, consumption of this, that, and the next thing. And if you added them all together, the traditional risk factors, the French were actually slightly worse than the Scots. Overall, not a huge difference. I mean, we're talking a percentage or two. And yet they had a fifth of the rate of heart disease. And I began to think, well, you know what? This doesn't really add up to me. This is wrong. And I think once you start that journey of thinking what I'm being told is not true here, you do end up on quite a long and complicated journey that takes you in many places you never expected to go in the first place.
I guess correct me if I'm wrong, but your major sort of hypothesis, so to speak, is that heart disease is related to thrombotic phenomenon. It's clotting is what's actually occurring. And you in your book, you nicely outline the rationale behind this. And it's interesting. I mean, not to be a spoiler, but you did mention, I think maybe it was around 1991 or so, that Pfizer was actively pursuing that line of thinking, and then they saw that Merck had developed a statin that looked like to be very lucrative, and that whole line of reasoning was shut down. Can you basically outline? I know you wrote a whole book on this, but kind of why do you think it's blood clotting and not just excess cholesterol floating around?
Well, the first part of the book is kind of my attempt at the demolition of the cholesterol hypothesis. I mean, the idea is obviously if you have a raised level of, and of course the terminology is terrible here because you don't have any cholesterol in your bloodstream. If it was free in your bloodstream, it would immediately clump into little clumps because it's not soluble in water. So it has to be carried around in lipoprotein, a small lipid protein sphere. Now there's about 5 or 6 different, depending on how you categorize it, there's about 5 or 6 different types of this. But the lipoprotein sphere that we say causes heart disease is LDL, which is low density lipoprotein, which many people have heard called bad cholesterol. Of course, it's not cholesterol. You know, calling something cholesterol because it carries cholesterol around is like calling a car a human being because you've got human beings inside cars. Well, it's just a stupid terminology. However, the LDL, the low density lipoprotein, when you start looking at it, and in fact, this goes back to my teaching in Aberdeen University, where a wise woman called Elspeth Smith, who was teaching us in a small group session, mentioned to us that LDL cannot pass or get through the endothelium. At the time, I had no idea what LDL was, and I didn't really know what the endothelium was, but I do know now. And the way she said it, it was a bit like, you know, in a mystery story in a detective novel. It's the key thing, and you think there's something about that. And I read everything she then ever wrote about heart disease, and she was a proponent of what I call the thrombogenic hypothesis. In other words, thrombo being blood clots, genic being the causal. And I thought, well, what's she talking about? And then you try and find out. When you talk about an LDL molecule, if an LDL molecule was about the size of a human being, then an endothelial cells line all blood vessels like tiles on a wall, except far more complicated than a tile on the wall, obviously. An endothelial cell would be about the size of a major sports stadium, just to give you some idea of the relative size. Now, for the LDL hypothesis to work, then this molecule has to arrive at one cell membrane on one side, come in the blood. So you've got an LDL molecule. It arrives at the cell membrane. It somehow or other gets through. It then travels about a half a mile in scale to the other side of the cell, where it arrives at the other cell membrane and then pops out the back of it. That would be a process that would have to occur for an LDL molecule to get through an endothelial cell. Now that process can't exist because there is no process for that to happen. We do know, of course, that LDL can get into cells because there are LDL receptors. So if a cell needs additional cholesterol or fats or whatever it needs from the LDL, it produces a receptor, the LDL molecule comes along, it locks onto it, and the whole thing is dragged into the cell. So we know that process can occur. But obviously that's nothing to do with any concentration gradient or anything of that sort. The cells can control the passage of single atoms or ions through gates. So the idea that because there's more LDL in the blood, it's somehow or other going to force its way into the cell is arrant nonsense. And then the idea that it can get across the cell and deposit itself into the artery wall behind requires an inside out LDL receptor on the inside of the cell membrane on the opposite side of the cell. These don't exist. You can't just push things into cells and push them out the other side. This is not a process that exists in nature. And so then the other explanation is that, well then it passes between the endothelial cells because you've got one endothelial cell next to another endothelial cell. There's a bit of a gap there, and the LDL must slip down between them. Well, again, this is completely impossible. If you look at what connects one cell to another in the human body, there are things called tight junctions and other sorts of junctions and boundary junctions, and they are basically protein strands stick out of each cell on either side, lock together, and then bind the cells incredibly tightly together. And these tight junctions prevent the passage again of ions. You can't get an ion past a tight junction. But the argument therefore seems to be, well, you can get an LDL molecule past the tight junction. Well, you can't do either thing unless there's damage, and that opens up an entirely new area. So when you start looking at the LDL hypothesis, for it to work requires that the basic physiology of human beings doesn't work or is gone, or there's some other form of transporting things around the body that don't work. I mean, there's actually a journal called Tight Junctions. No, yeah, it's called. No, it's not a giant barrier. There is an entire journal on barrier function of cells, which says if you break down the endothelial barriers between cells, if you break down the tight junctions, then the human life and any complex form of life ceases to exist, because everything can then just leak straight through and into the spaces between the cells. And in fact, it's interesting. I looked at Ebola virus, and you say Ebola virus, we've all heard of it. It's a terrible disease, which makes COVID look like cotton wool. But what the Ebola virus does, and the reason it kills you, is because the Ebola virus, for whatever reason, opens up the junctions between endothelial cells. This allows blood and other parts of the blood to leak into tissues, which is why you get hemorrhagic fever. It's why it's called hemorrhagic fever. So the blood can now escape from the endothelial barrier, and then you die. So again, this is just an example. This barrier function exists. It exists to keep us alive. If it wasn't there, we would be dead. And yet, for the LDL hypothesis to work, then this has to not exist. So once you start looking at the actual processes required for the LDL hypothesis to be correct, it just doesn't work. It makes absolutely no sense. And so when you start looking, if you like, at process, and this is what I ended up about 10 years ago, then I started saying, well, what is the process that can be causing heart disease? What is it? If it's not LDL, what is it? Does that make sense, or am I gibbering?
No, I mean, I've read your book and it makes sense, and I've seen this stuff for, you talking about this stuff for a while. But so a couple of questions I have to you. So let's presume, which I think is safe to do, that there is some endothelial disruption. It's damaged in some way, shape, or form. You point to smoking and hyperglycemia and all these things that cause a disruption in that endothelial layer, so that now you can have something get past it. So what about the people who say, well, yeah, maybe the hyperglycemia damages endothelium, and then all that cholesterol floating around can now sneak in there, and that's how we're getting that. Now I mean, I know you talk about red blood cells, and I think that's a really interesting. I'd never heard that, by the way, the lipoprotein A association with red blood cells in a greater concentration, which I thought was fascinating. As you described that in the book. So maybe, and the other thing I've heard about was the vasa vasorum, which we know they're the little blood vessels that feed the larger arteries, and they somehow you can get cholesterol through the vasa vasorum into that subendothelial layer. Maybe they're damaged capillaries, and that happens. Thoughts on maybe those? So somebody might say that it's still high cholesterol, but now you have damaged endothelium. The cholesterol is still causing it. What are your thoughts on that? And talk about the clotting.
Well, I think, I mean, obviously with any hypothesis, there are issues that you don't know for sure. And what we do know for sure is that if you damage the endothelial cells, either damage them or strip them away, or whatever exactly the process is, almost instantaneously this triggers blood clot to form at that point. Because if you damage the endothelium, then in the artery wall behind, you have what's called tissue factor. Tissue factor is an extraordinarily powerful trigger for blood clot formation. It overrides what they call the intrinsic blood clotting system. All the factor 8 and 9 and 10 and all those things you've heard of effectively take a while to get the fibrin together. If you expose the blood to tissue factor, it's like that. Well, for the very obvious reason, if you damage a large blood vessel, it needs to clot right then and there, and it can't be waiting around. So the possibility that you can have damaged endothelium, which allows LDL, and by the way, only LDL, what about all the other substances in the blood, to leak through and start being deposited there? I'm sure that a little bit, or some of it may leak through. I'm sure a little bit of everything might leak through, including red blood cells and whatever at first. But there is once the clot is formed on top of the endothelium, and that happens pretty much instantaneously. I don't know what the concept of instantaneous here, a millionth of a second, a tenth of a second, but it's happening within a second. It seems unlikely that is the pathway through which LDL, because it would have to be LDL, and why not every other lipoprotein? I mean, we have chylomicrons, we have VLDL, we have HDL, we have all sorts of other things that could leak through a breach in an endothelial wall. You've got albumin, you've got all the things you can think of that are in the bloodstream. Why aren't they all there? Well, they are all there, but why wouldn't they all be there if that was the answer for the Ldl hypothesis? I think a more complex problem is the one you've outlined, is that all large blood vessels, big enough to have atherosclerosis in them anyway, are supplied by their own blood vessels, the vasa vasorum blood vessels of the blood vessels. These are like small arterioles and capillaries that start at the outer side, the adventitia, and then grow into the artery wall and supply the artery wall with nutrients and all the things that they need. Because you can't get enough diffusion or transport from the blood, if you like, to get into the artery wall to keep it healthy. So yes, the vasa vasorum, once blood vessels become very small, once they become capillaries and arterioles, the endothelium is no longer a locked together structure. It's got holes in it. It's got what we call fenestrations, and the basement membrane loosened, and there are gaps between some of the endothelial cells. As of course there has to be, because when you get to the end of the blood vessels, you get to the size of a capillary inside, say, a nephron, the waste products and everything have to be able to leak in and out. Otherwise, the kidneys couldn't function and the blood would just go straight through and come back out again. So things have to be able to go back and forward at that submolecular level within the capillary. But we do know also that that within the brain we have the blood-brain barrier, which everyone's heard of, but no one probably knows what it is. But the blood-brain barrier basically means that when you reach the scale of a capillary in the brain, the endothelium has no fenestrations and it is still tightly locked together, and the basement membrane is still tightly locked around it. So what you have is essentially an impenetrable barrier. It's not completely impenetrable because, of course, there are ways of getting things into cells and out the other side. That's well known. One thing you cannot get out of the blood and into the brain, however, is LDL. That is not allowed to transport itself through. And that's the reason why the brain has to manufacture its own cholesterol. So cholesterol is manufactured within the brain itself by glial cells, which then produce the cholesterol required for neurons to function. And if you do tracker radioactive tracing experiments on animals, you can show that if you give animals cholesterol to eat, none of that cholesterol ends up in the brain. It is synthesized separately. So we know that even at the smallest level in the brain, we have a function that stops the transfer of LDL or HDL or any other L that you want. But however, within the vasa vasorum, there isn't really anything to stop the LDL from leaking out and into the artery wall itself. And you say, well, so there is a route for LDL to get into the artery wall. And I say, well, yes, there is a route for the LDL to get into the artery wall. You're quite right. That route also, however, exists in all of the blood vessels in the veins. In fact, veins have more vasa vasorum than arteries do. So why then wouldn't the same process of leakage and development of LDL building up occur in veins? And why does it never occur in the arteries and veins? Well, it does sometimes occur in the lungs. The pulmonary circulation, and then the pulmonary circulation, some of the arteries and veins there also have vasa vasorum, but unless there is pulmonary hypertension or some other abnormality in the lungs, you never get atherosclerosis building up there. The only times that happens is when you have things like Eisenmenger syndrome or pulmonary hypertension for other reasons, or blood clots that travel into the lungs and then get stuck. And these can be transformed into atherosclerotic plaques. Does that sort of answer the question or not?
Yeah, no, it makes sense to me. Like I said, you outlined it very nicely in your book, but I know probably most of the people listening haven't yet read your book yet since it just came out. I've got a question about, so this is something I read in one of your blog posts, and you've got, as you probably know, you've got a lot of writing out there, so you can't read it, it's tough to read it all. But I remember somewhere, talking about this, this sort of thrum, this concern of clotting leading to heart disease, and things that increase the likelihood of clotting are going to increase the likelihood of heart disease. And you outline, several situations about the case. But at one point, I don't think I saw you mention it in the book, but tell me if you still feel this way. You had mentioned somewhere that triglycerides were uniquely thrombogenic. Is that still something you think contributes significantly to heart disease?
Yeah, I mean, of course, in a way, I kind of steer away from the fact that everything in the bloodstream is connected to blood clotting virtually. Everything gets dragged in. Triglycerides, or what you'd also call very low density lipoproteins, are prothrombotic. If you drop triglycerides into blood, it just clots around it. In fact, the creation of fibrin tends to occur on the lipid surfaces of lipoproteins. In fact, that tends to be where it's put together. So the lipoproteins will always become incorporated, at least in part, into any blood clot. And yes, LDL is mildly prothrombotic, and HDL is actually quite a potent anti-thrombotic agent. Well, it's not an agent, it's a thing. It's a lipoprotein. So yes, there is a connection between lipoproteins and blood clotting, and it tends to go with VLDL. Seems to be the most potent of the coagulant lipoproteins. HDL is the most anticoagulant lipoprotein, and that's an interesting area. I mean, in part, I'm guilty of not mentioning it in the book because I thought that would just add a layer of complication that would confuse it further and say, oh, you're saying lipoproteins do cause heart disease. Then I'm going, well, they do a little bit, but I consider them very minor players.
Yeah, and that's something, we're seeing, like some of the newer studies coming out. I know the Women's Health Study that came out in 2021, analyzing factors for cardiovascular disease, showing that by far, diabetes basically and diabetic pathophysiology seem to be the big takeaway there. And in your book, you outlined several factors. I do want to ask one thing, because I've seen, I've pointed out a number of studies where, like particularly with all-cause mortality, you'll see like there's a large study out of Korea, 12 million people, total cholesterol, 210 to 240 seem to be the sweet spot for low all-cause mortality. And people are saying, well, reverse causality. And then the other thing they always throw out is Mendelian randomization studies. And, they'll say, well, those studies suggest that, and it's very complicated. There's a lot of mental gymnastics you have to be able to jump through to make it sense to you. How do you counter those people say, well, it's all about the Mendelian randomization allows us to discount all these other factors and we can just figure it out that way? What are your thoughts on that argument?
Well, as you say, in part, first of all, you've got to understand it, and that can be very complicated. There is a study in the UK called the Uk Biobank Study, where they've tried to analyze all the factors associated with cardiovascular disease, and that is general factors like diabetes or smoking or whatever, plus the genetic factors. And the last time I looked, and this was about a year ago, they couldn't find any specific genetic factors that were correlated with cardiovascular disease. So I don't know how you can do a Mendelian randomization study when you can't find a genetic factor that is any single or any group of factors that they could find that are associated with an increased or otherwise risk of cardiovascular disease. I mean, what are they doing? I do know that, I mean, recently the redefinition of familiar hypercholesterolemia includes people who have a gene for FH but do not have raised cholesterol levels, or LDL levels. So you can appear to nowadays have a situation where you can be genetically considered at risk for a condition, yet not have that condition, and yet still be considered at risk. This seems to be stretching logic beyond its possible boundaries. I mean, the other thing that I did write a study recently, which showed that in fact that blood clotting factors and familiar hypercholesterolemia, hypercoagulation, and familiar hypercholesterolemia are quite often very closely related in the gene loci. And in fact, what's very interesting is if you lack LDL receptors or have dysfunctional LDL receptors, one of the functions of LDL receptors is to remove factor VIII and two other clotting factors I can't remember off the top of my head from the blood circulation. So again, we have a correlate. It depends with these Mendelian randomizations. It depends. You've got to start. Your assumptions have to be correct at the start that we know which of the things are related. we have entire populations and entire countries where the rates of heart disease are enormously different, such as, we know that Japan has always had a very low rate of cardiovascular disease and coronary heart disease. It's actually had quite a high rate of strokes at one time. And if you take a Japanese person and to take them to the United States, then their risk of cardiovascular disease becomes the same in certain circumstances. But anyway, it is clearly an environmental issue that's doing this. You have entirely similar population like the Kitavans, who apparently have the lowest rate of heart disease in the world currently. There's nothing genetically about these people that we can find. They don't have low LDL levels. There's nothing about them. So I can't understand these Mendelian randomization studies, because I can't find any genetic markers or factors that are closely or clearly associated with cardiovascular disease. There are some. I mean, yes, you can find a condition such as antiphospholipid syndrome or Hughes syndrome, whereby you have an inflammation of the endothelium and damage to that, followed by blood clotting, an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, atherosclerosis, etc. There are genetic conditions that are associated with an increased risk of heart disease, but what are they doing with the Mendelian randomization? If they could ever explain it to me in words of less than 73 syllables, I might have some understanding. But I've looked at the genetics of cardiovascular disease, and I can't find any genetics apart from specific examples such as this. So if you look at familial hypercholesterolemia, for example, what you can find within that grouping of people is that, yes, there are a small number of people with familial hypercholesterolemia who die quite young of cardiovascular disease. The average life expectancy in familial hypercholesterolemia is the same as the surrounding population. And by the time you reach the age of about 55 or 60, you actually have a reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, even though you've got familial hypercholesterolemia. But the thing about this small group of people with a raised risk, is that they have genetic markers. So you can get, the gene studies show that you can get twins, one of whom has the familial hypercholesterolemia as raised cholesterol. The other one has the gene but doesn't have it, but it has the clotting factor abnormality, and they both have the same risk of cardiovascular disease. So you have to put the right markers into Mendelian randomization studies for them to make any sense whatsoever. And the other suggestion being that you have a risk of having a raised LDL level, which puts you at risk of heart disease. However, when we measure your LDL level, it's not raised. So through what mechanism is it happening? If there's so many problems with it. I can't. It's just, to me, it's nonsense.
Yeah, that's interesting. So when it's kind of interesting in the book, you outline, what this means as far as years life expectancy. You do some interesting calculations to show how scared or not scared we should be about certain things. But two of the things that you'd mentioned that which you gave quite a bit of import for cardiovascular disease, which kind of I didn't really think so much about. One was, disturbances in the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, stress, and all that. So, and then the other thing was potassium. Both those things I would have not put real high up there. But talk about those things, because they feature pretty prominently in the second half of the book.
Yeah. Well, for many years, I was a stressed man. And I thought, as you know in the book I explain, I think we should call it strain, not stress, but we use the word stress because everybody does. In that, when I went to France, the other thing I noticed was that everybody was eating very slowly and in a very relaxed fashion. And I had friends around and were drinking red wine. And I thought, I wonder if how you eat is really important, because obviously you have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system, and you have the yin and the yang, if you like, of the metabolic system. So if you're eating whilst mentally or physically stressed, the hormones and the neurological system is battling against insulin. So catabolism and anabolism are battling it out. Now there is some quite interesting studies that have been done showing that if you put people under stress and they eat, their blood sugars go higher and their triglycerides go higher. So and then I thought, but there's a general stress issue going on here. And I still think that's a very important aspect, because people who are stressed to the point where you can actually measure that their hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis is not functioning normally, which generally means a flattened cortisol level. So you lose the natural peaks and troughs of cortisol during the day. That tends to mean you have, to use a vernacular term, a sort of burnt out axis. These people seem, they're much more likely to develop type 2 diabetes. They're much more likely to develop things like central obesity. They're much far more likely to have all sorts of metabolic issues going on. So I do think, and I did think that that evidence was actually a very interesting. There's a researcher from Sweden called Bjorntorp who worked with another chap called Rosen, who and they looked at people in 2 countries. They looked at people in Sweden and Lithuania. And at the time, Lithuania had 5 times the rate of heart disease of Sweden, with all other risk factors being roughly equivalent. And when they went to study them, they found that essentially that these people were what they called suffering from virtual exhaustion. If you did a cortisol test with them, I can't remember which test they did exactly, but the cortisol rise was strictly reduced in the Lithuanian men compared to the Swedish men. They reported more depression, there was more central obesity, etc., etc. So the process appears to be chronic negative stressors, whatever they may be, create problems with the HPA axis, which leads to downstream metabolic chaos, if you like, with including type 2 diabetes, raised sugar levels, raised blood clotting levels, etc., etc., that then lead on to cardiovascular disease. And there's some very interesting research that's been done in this area. And if you look at, in fact, Lithuania is an interesting example, because if you look at their heart disease rate, it was from about 1980, it was gradually declining. And then in 1989, it went up. It doubled over a 2-year period. And then it fell. It's like a graph with Mount Everest in the middle of it. And you ask yourself, what happened in 1989? Well, what happened in 1989 is the Berlin Wall came down, there was a revolution, the entire economy went through the floor, there was enormous social upheaval and social unrest, and the heart disease rate went through the roof. And you can see exactly the same pattern in a number of ex-Soviet countries. And in fact, interestingly, if you look at a list of the 20 top countries for cardiovascular disease in the world, it includes 10 of them are ex-Soviet countries. And taking up about any other countries are countries like Sudan and Yemen and Syria and whatever. So when people say who's got the highest rates of heart disease, the countries with the highest rates of heart disease have the most distressed and damaged, psychosocially damaged peoples in the world. Because as you know, the population with, I think, that's got the highest rate of heart disease are actually Australian Aboriginals. And if you look at Australian Aboriginals, what you find is that they have lost the peak morning cortisol peak, and it's just flattened. And they have enormously high rates of type 2 diabetes. They have enormously high rates of chronic kidney disease, and they've got rates of cardiovascular disease that are, in some cases, for young Aboriginal women, 30 times that of the surrounding Caucasian sort of European immigrant population, if you like. So I think that you can see quite a strong and straightforward linkage between the mental stresses and how that creates the physiological upset, the metabolic upset that leads to many of the problems that I've discussed. And I think that's very important. And if you say, well, why did Scotland have such a high rate of heart disease at one time? Well, it was the highest in Glasgow at the time, and in Glasgow they took about 750,000 people and moved them out of the centre of Glasgow, stripped them away from their family relationships, and put them into what they call new towns, which were horrible, like concrete blocks, and then they started to die. Of course, it's not as straightforward as that. So that was the sort of mental stress, HbA upset. When it came to the potassium thing, there were just 2 or 3 things with potassium.
Let me just, before we go to potassium, What is your prediction? I mean, a lot, with this global pandemic, a lot of it, people have been put under stress for one reason or the other. Either you're upset about being locked down, or you don't have a job, or you're just worried about getting sick. Are you predicting a peak or a rise in heart disease over the next year or two due to this? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as Niels Bohr said, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future. But yeah, I do. I mean, there have actually been reports in the United Kingdom of sudden increases in cardiovascular disease deaths in Scotland at the moment, as they've gone up considerably. I think the stress is, I'm not sure. I think I would expect to see an increased rate of cardiovascular disease death over the next few years in many countries. I think that will happen. Of course, there is a background of cardiovascular deaths going down, so even if it flattens out, but I do think so. I think we will see that. There's my prediction. I'll probably be wrong now, but I think it may be right.
Okay. You got a 50-50 chance. So potassium, because we always hear about, you got to cut sodium, Your thought is it's sodium potassium ratio that's really the problem.
Well, yeah, I mean, we've got to cut sodium. It's another of these. It's a bit like you mustn't eat saturated fat, it's bad for you. I mean, it's another thing that is widely, and everybody says it. And when you look for the evidence, you think, I can't find any. The latest NHANA, or however you pronounce it, study in the US basically showed that if you have below about, I can't remember the exact figure, but anyway, people who were eating less sodium were more likely to die, and more likely to die from cardiovascular disease. The problem with eating less sodium is, of course, your body, not your entire, but a large part of your physiology is designed to keep the blood pressure up if there's not enough sodium in the system. And that is, of course, the renin and aldosterone angiotensin system. So if you reduce sodium, your kidneys start to go, hold on, we need to keep hold of sodium. So they start producing renin and aldosterone, and of course the dreaded angiotensin, which you've all heard of with regard to COVID. But it's the angiotensin 2 that is quite damaging to the cardiovascular system. It causes endothelial cell damage. It constricts blood vessels. It raises the heart rate, etc., etc. And it's in fact the ACE2 receptor that reduces angiotensin 2. So that what I call the RAS monster is something you need to keep quiet. One way to keep it quiet is to give your body enough sodium, and then it shuts down and switches off. But of course, there's another issue here, is that we ignore at our peril other ions, and potassium is very important. And if you look at the studies, in fact, if you increase potassium rather than reducing sodium, you end up with a much better balance between these two. Of course, as we all know, everybody doesn't know, essentially your entire body works because we pump, I'll get this the wrong way around, won't I? We pump potassium into cells and pump sodium back out of cells to keep an action potential, and that drives most of the processes in the body. And of course, for a neuron to fire, that process goes into reverse, and you send an electronic stimulus down the whole neuron. But with potassium and sodium, you need a balance. And I've seen studies that said our primitive forebears were eating around about 12 to 16 times as much potassium as we do now. I first became alerted to the importance of potassium because there was a study called the Scottish Heart Health Study, where they looked at 26 factors that were associated with a reduction in cardiovascular, or an increase in cardiovascular disease. And potassium, of all the things, came out top. People who excreted the most potassium, i.e. ate the most potassium, had a reduced risk of about threefold reduced risk of dying of cardiovascular disease. I've never seen a figure as dramatic as that since, but I have seen figures that match that. And so, and you may remember that Finland at one time had the highest rate of heart disease in the world in the 1960s, before Scotland. And they carried out an experiment called the North Karelia experiment. And one of the things they did in the North Karelia experiment was they replaced salt with low salt, which is KCl, not NaCl. And they saw quite a dramatic reduction in the rate of cardiovascular disease. Now, they claimed that that was due to the other things that they did, but it was another example of an intervention that appeared to cause this. And we can see that if you give people increased potassium, people who consume more potassium, this lowers your blood pressure more than reducing sodium. So I think that the thing that we have here is actually, it's a balance between sodium and potassium. And if you just reduce the sodium, this can cause problems. What you need to do is actually increase the potassium. And this gets rid of the issues to do with the sodium being high. Because one thing that people never look at is chloride. They go, well, if you eat salt NaCl, what happens to the chloride? Where does it go? Well, it goes into the body. And all the studies that I have seen show that lower levels of chloride are associated with higher levels of mortality and cardiovascular mortality. There is another thing. It's not just sodium, it's also chloride. So, I mean, yes, the potassium issue is one that I think is important. And I do advise people, don't bother cutting down sodium, increase your potassium. And this will actually balance things off for you and allow you to have better cardiovascular health whilst keeping your renin-angiotensin system quiet.
That's a great explanation, Malcolm. Let me ask you, there was a couple things in there that you sort of said, well, they weren't as big of a deal. One, which was really interesting, was obesity. Now, obesity is accompanied with a lot of things that are problems, diabetes, so on and so forth. And then I think blood pressure was kind of like, unless it's, you know, like the standard elevation of 10 points is kind of not that big of a deal. Did I read that correctly? Were those were just kind of,
well, yeah, it was, you know, yeah, if you look at the figures for if your blood pressure is this or this or this, what is the increased risk of, and I used overall mortality rather than just cardiovascular mortality. And it's less, I think my calculation of it reminds off the top of my head, if you had a blood pressure of about 160, no, about 180 systolic over a 40-year period, that would reduce your life expectancy by around about 18 months, which is not to be sniffed at, but it's perhaps not as great as people might imagine it would be. I think the secondary problem is that if you lower blood pressure, it has less, you know, if your risk is increased by this much by having your blood pressure high, if you lower your blood pressure, you don't reduce the risk by the same amount, you reduce it by about that amount, a much, much smaller amount. So it's much better not to have the high blood pressure in the first place, obviously, because once you start giving the medications, are you dealing with the underlying issues and are you causing other problems with the medication itself? So, I mean, the very first study that came out on treatment of what they call mild to moderate high blood pressure was the MRC study in the UK, and it came out in 1981. And they studied about 18,000 people, 9,000 in either arm over 5 years, and they lowered blood pressure by what we consider, I can't remember the exact figure, but they lowered it by about 10, 15 systolic. And at the end of that study, the differences in overall mortality were actually zero between the placebo and the treatment group. And they didn't find any difference in coronary heart disease death. There was a small difference in stroke death, which was, if the figures remind me, it was something like about 18 less deaths for 9,000 people over 5 years. So this was not terribly impressive. And in truth, if you look at the figures since then, there's not much that is much better than that. The benefits of lowering blood pressure with medications are pretty marginal, really. Yeah. I'm talking.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, we see this theme, you know, I mean, there was an Accord study looking at the benefits of lowering hemoglobin A1C with intensive medications, and the outcomes were, I mean, in fact, I think they were worse, if I'm not mistaken, in that particular instance. And so we see this theme repeated over. You can change a biomarker with drugs. In fact, that's what many of these drugs are designed to do. But the risk, even though you lower that quote unquote risk factor, the overall outcome is often not better. And I know I would guess you're probably not the biggest fan of the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, it has its uses, but they've got some issues to talk about.
Well, if you got a pension fund, it's a good thing. But I mean, it's the same thing. The Accord study, as you say, you're quite right. They one arm of the study would try to get the blood sugar level down, the HbA1c as low as possible. They had to stop that study early because the increase in mortality in that group was so large that it was unethical to continue. Hammering things down. I use the word hysteresis, but people keep telling me it's the wrong word. You bend something so far that basically you can never get it straight again. You've overbent it. And I sometimes think when you've got systems that have gone wrong, just trying to straighten them out again, you actually, whilst you think you've straightened it, you haven't really. The thing is still going wrong. And then you've got all the underlying problems of the medications themselves. I mean, you give, all the blood pressure lowering medications have got potential adverse effects on your kidneys, etc., and problems with various electrolytes and whatever. So it's, you're forcing things back. I don't know if you ever heard of the Greek bandit called Procrustes, who when he found people crossing his path, he would tie them to a bed, and if they were too tall, he would chop a bit off, and if they were too short, he would stretch them. And whichever of those two processes he carried out, both killed him. And I sometimes think that medicine creates its own Procrustean bed. We see things that we think are abnormal, and then we try and stretch and chop things off people in order to get them to fit. And you have to be very careful when you do these things, because there is an underlying reason why this is going wrong, and you are not dealing with it. You are not curing it. You're just hammering it down. And whilst, if the blood pressure is 240 over 160, yeah, well, got to do something about that, or your brain's going to pop. But for an awful lot of people, I think that the benefits are distinctly less impressive than you would think. And so there's other things going on. So yes, I'm not very keen on long-term treatment of as you say, just markers in the blood. I just think that's a very, very limited approach to looking at disease. Yeah.
Yeah, it's perfectly makes sense. Let's talk, because you mentioned obesity again. In the book, and I can't remember if it was cardiovascular all-cause mortality, but you said like, obesity is really not a big factor unless it's accompanied by X, Y, and Z that are.
Yeah.
What's the story on obesity?
Well, it's something I've written about before. It seems to cause people great angst. If your BMI is between 30 and 35, then your life expectancy is slightly better than if your BMI is between 18 and 25. Now, these figures are not huge. I mean, we're talking small differences. I think the problem is that we've done this. They do this clumping together thing in epidemiology with obesity, as they do with alcohol consumption. Is they go here are quartiles or quintiles or whatever they are. Here's quartile 1, quartile 2, quartile 3, quartile 4. And the fourth quartile includes people whose body mass index is 30 and above, including people who've got body mass indexes of 90. Well, clearly, what you're doing is you're enormously skewing everything, because people who've got body mass indexes of 70 or whatever, I mean, this really is a problem. But actually, until you get to a body mass index above 35, the evidence is, and I can see no evidence from anyone else to contradict this, there really isn't an increase in overall mortality. The overall mortality in this case, rather than specific conditions. And in fact, therefore, when we call people overweight, the lowest mortality rates consistently that you can find are people who've got a body mass index between 25 and 30. So we call these people overweight, but they've got a lower mortality rate than people whose body mass index is between 20 and 25, who are apparently optimal weight. So you have to ask the question, I mean, from what are the reasons for this? How can this possibly be, when of course we say that when you're obese, you're much more likely to get diabetes, and diabetes can cause heart disease and blah, 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 and all sorts of things. Sorry.
I was just going to cut in, and I said, that makes me good to hear, because my body mass routinely runs around 28, 29. But one of the things I've seen, and I've seen this argument made about, the BMI, but the protective aspect of the higher BMI is thought to be lean mass. People actually have more lean mass, and, and that's protecting them even if they have some excess body fat. And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's a reasonable hypothesis. I mean, I think that I think people who are over thin, if you like, if they do run into a problem, and it seems to be as you get older, if you don't have much material around your skeleton, then you can start running into problems a lot more quickly. You know, I don't know what the explanation is. I can just look at the figures and point them out and say it isn't really a problem until you're really fat. If you've got other problems, I mean, here I haven't even touched on it. It's something that I may write about at some point, but tend to stay quiet about, is that I think we've got the entire causal chain linking obesity to type 2 diabetes a bit muddled up. I mean, currently we say if you eat too much, you put on weight, you become insulin resistant, you become diabetic. That's if you like the model that we all see. However, my own view is that it's the increased and excess insulin production that starts the process that leads to you becoming obese. In other words, you become obese as a result of excess production of insulin in response to food. And so it is not that obesity causes diabetes, it is that diabetes causes obesity. That's a simplistic view, and I know people, but the moment I say this to people, they start going purple as rage. I just say to them, have a look at the Pima Indians of South America, and the southern US and North Mexico sometime. These are the most diabetic group of people in the world, even more than the Rorotungans of the Pacific Islands. And what happens with these people is if you feed them, if you do a glucose tolerance test when they're young and healthy and lean, they produce twice as much insulin in response to a glucose tolerance test as the surrounding population. And they then become obese and they then become diabetic. So the process to me is that we're looking at is the excess insulin production, which is why I agree with the hypothesis that if we excess carbohydrate intake by driving excess insulin secretion drives obesity, and therefore this is the linking that we've got. So just being obese of itself, I mean, you'll know yourself, you can see some people who are enormously obese, hugely obese, and yet are not showing any signs of insulin resistance or diabetes. And you think, well, why is this? And then I would just say to people, we'll go and have a look at Bernard-Anelli-Ciet syndrome sometime, which you may or may not have heard of, also called congenital generalized lipodystrophy. People who have no fat cells, there aren't many of them, all have severe type 2 diabetes. And every single one of them, and they have hugely high triglyceride levels, they have enormously high insulin levels, etc., etc. So how can this be? If obesity causes diabetes, how can people who have no fat cells all be diabetic? And the answer is that they are full, basically, and there's nowhere to put their energy stores. So, and people who are enormously obese who are not diabetic are people who are fantastic energy storers, so that they can keep storing energy, and keep storing energy, and keep storing energy, and they never have a problem. They just keep creating more fat cells until they are huge. And it's people who can't do that are the ones that actually become diabetic. Anyway, that's a secondary issue, but it's a particular issue of interest of mine looking at that.
Yeah, you would have a friend in guys like David Ludwig, who has been promoting and pushing the research behind the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis, and obviously he has many detractors, and I'm sure you would as well once you push that. It's interesting. I think I saw like we see some of the Pacific Islanders and people that are kind of, I guess, similar in nature, because of maybe in their background, Pacific Islanders got to those islands by long journeys across oceans, and they had to be able to store fat because they weren't going to get much food on the way there. And so it was kind of a genetic thing. But you mentioned, and I guess some of the critics would say, well, you said if you eat carbohydrates to excess, and then the question becomes, what is excess, and does that mean I just eat enough carbohydrates until I get fat, and then I'm in excess? So it's kind of a tautologic type of statement, I suppose.
Well, yeah, it is. I use my son as an example of someone who appears to be able to eat 6,000 calories of carbohydrates and remains like a stick insect, which is very unfair, I believe. Whereas I can't do that myself. So and I think as you get older that changes. But no, I mean the issue here is we have different metabolisms, and I agree with you. I think the Pima Indians and the Rarotongans and the Fijians and the Samoans are people who are naturally prone to develop obesity. And I think they do have a different genetic response to foodstuffs. I mean, you look at these, they don't do much rugby union in the US, but when you look at some of these Pacific Islanders, they are absolutely just enormous people, physically terrifyingly huge. You think, they don't look like me. I don't think I could ever look like that. I mean, these are not the ones that are obese. These are just the ones that are trained up until they're, you know, it's Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. He's from Samoa, isn't he? And you just think that's a big guy. But yeah, no. Anyway, that's kind of sidestepping issues. But
I'll put in the personal anecdote, Malcolm. I know I played high-level rugby in New Zealand, and I remember every time I ran into one of these Pacific Islanders, it was like running into a brick wall. I much preferred running into Europeans and Russians and those guys because they hit hard and they were hard to hit. That's for sure. But anyway, we've gone through about an hour, and that's usually what we do with this. And I really want to thank you for one, just for the work you put out into the world for people to learn about this stuff, and then obviously for coming on to our community. Can you let people know where they can go to get this book and other books, and where to find you? I know you've got a nice.
Yeah. Well, at the moment, I do have a website, drmalcolmkendrick.org, and on that you can go directly to the publisher in the UK to buy the book. They are getting samples that can be exported. You can get the book from an organization that sounds like a river in South America, called Amazon. It is there, along with Doctoring Data and a couple of other books that I've written. So at the moment, that's the place. But if you can buy it directly from the publisher, I would be grateful for me and the publisher, because Amazon takes 70% off the sale price of every book and keeps it for themselves before they allow anyone else to get any money. So in order to allow small publishers to exist, it's nice if people could buy it there if they can. We are hoping to get it more available as a. You can buy it as a Kindle book, obviously, off Amazon, which a lot of people like. If you want it as a physical book, it's a bit more expensive to buy, obviously, because you have to ship it out to the States. So, but I hope people can enjoy it. We perhaps maybe I can cover a bit more about the thrombogenic hypothesis next time. I always tend to find I end up talking about all sorts of things that I'm a terrible salesman for my book.
Well, no, that's right. Well, I mean, the book is a good salesman for itself. It's a great book. Let me ask you just, and one thing we won't find you is on Wikipedia. Is that correct? I think, didn't they ban you from Wikipedia?
Oh, yeah, I got wiped out of Wikipedia. You can find me on Rational Wiki if you want, which says that I'm an idiotic lunatic who understands nothing and is terribly dangerous and should basically be banned from everything forever. Which, you know, I take as a kind of, I take that as a compliment. No, I mean, it is a shame that we are living in a medical scientific world at the moment that is has never been seen before, which is incredibly censorious, and you are just getting wiped out if you have views that just don't fit. And it's a bit of a worrying place, I must say, at the moment, for people who want to carry out scientific debate. But anyway, you won't find me on Wikipedia, that's for sure.
Yeah, I'm on Rational Wikipedia as well, so I join you in there. And I think the problem is we've got people saying make Orwell fiction again, because it seems a little scary these days.
It is a bit. It is. I don't know what we can do about it, but there are still, I think, there are like-minded people who are forming into communities that want to hear different views, and are not cowed, I hope, by what's going on. But it is a scary world we live in, I think, unfortunately.
Well, it is indeed. Well, Malcolm, thank you so much. And again, best of luck to you. And like, maybe we can do this again down the road if you're up.
That'll be good. Yeah. Well, happy Christmas to everybody. We like to say that anymore. It's happy holiday season or something.
Yeah. All right, guys. You guys take care. And thanks again. We'll see everybody tomorrow. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye now. Thanks, Malcolm. Bye-bye.
Join Revero.health for a 30-day free trial to get access to live Q&A with VIP guests, social community meetings, member discounts, low-carb healthcare providers list, forum, workouts, monthly challenges, early access to podcasts, recipes, carnivore diet guide, fasting guide, shred guide, and much more.